Okay, well, we're going to get started tonight. If everyone could mute themselves, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you all for coming to our event as we are continuing to offer all of our programming via Zoom or other types of electronic resources. And tonight's program is going to be a really interesting one, I'm sure, because what we do a lot of in the Oakland History Room is help researchers who are working to build historic narratives as much as possible. But a very interesting part of that research has to do with digging into the genealogy of the subjects that figure prominently in our historical narratives. And expanding and broadening those narratives is really important to the work that we do in the Oakland History Center and the work that several similar agencies throughout the state and the country are doing to try to expand our understanding of what has gone before and the histories that have gone before. So tonight, our program, Revisiting Historical Narratives Through Genealogical Research, we have with us Mariah Ulenskas. She is an audiovisual archivist and a PhD candidate in public history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on the impact of post-war redevelopment programs on communities of color with a focus on community archives. She is a founding member of the Community Archiving Workshop, popularly known as CAW, a collective of film and video archivists who work to help communities maintain intellectual control over their legacy recordings. She manages CAW's Training of Trainers project, which I've participated in. It's a wonderful project. And the Audiovisual Collections Care and Tribal Archives project. So help me in welcoming Mariah. Mariah, take it away.
All right, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Let me share, make sure I share the right screen. It's always something that makes me nervous. All right, can folks see this first slide? Give me a thumbs. Okay. All right, so thank you, Dorothy, for having me here tonight. And thanks for everyone for showing interest in what to me is really one of the most fascinating, but often overlooked parts of historical research, which is biographical sketches. As Dorothy mentioned, I'm an audiovisual archivist, meaning that my primary concern is around photographs, film and video, and audio recordings. And in this role, I'm often tasked with processing, which is like fancy archival speak for just organizing and describing what we refer to as orphaned collections. All right, so these are papers, photos, and ephemera, which are recognized to have a historical value, but we don't really know much about the individuals who are portrayed in them. And in order to describe a collection, we have to do some detective work to tell the story of the person or the people in it. The Kazumi Takahashi collection, some of what you see here, consisted of hundreds of loose photographs, a couple of photo albums, some letters, and a yearbook. If I remember correctly, this collection had been acquired in an estate sale by a collector who tried to sell it to the San Francisco Public Library because of its documentation of San Francisco's Japanese American community. But Susan Goldstein, the city archivist, managed to get the collector to donate it instead. When the collection came in, it was unclear who these people were, and the seller had simply titled the collection Japanese Family Photos. Luckily, the photo albums in the collection have these handwritten captions in them, which served as a great guide. And I basically started memorizing faces as I went through all of the photos. One of the photo albums had written on the inside cover, property of Kazumi Takahashi, which is kind of like the real ding, ding, ding discovery moment, because now I at least know whose album this was, if not the whole collection. The yearbook in the collection was from San Francisco's High School of Commerce, dated 1937. And this was another really solid clue since it identified Masuko, here Margaret Oda, one of the main people in the collection. And it gave me a rough estimate for her age to begin to do genealogical research. I promised Dorothy that I would focus this presentation on Oakland, so we can come back to this collection later if we have time. But I wanted to share it as an example quickly to show you how I start genealogical research when I'm sitting in front of a bunch of unidentified materials. This is from another collection that I also processed at the San Francisco Public Library, and it also has not a yearbook, but a class photo from the same year, 1937, at another San Francisco public school. And this is another one we can come back to later, or I can share a little photo essay that I wrote about it, because Lilly Mae King, who you see here, she's marked herself with like a X over her head and a little chevron. She's amazing. She is a woman who fought against San Francisco's Redevelopment Agency in the Fillmore in the 1960s. And of course, she's just a teenager in this picture, but I feel like knowing someone's background, knowing their origin story is so important for understanding why they chose the paths that they did and why they dug their heels in the way that they did. I like to do this work, and as a public historian, I try to focus on these narratives of fairly regular, everyday people, because it's important to emphasize that most historic movements were experienced and powered by regular people. I also personally find it empowering to know that people who changed the world were single moms, who had multiple jobs and meandering professions. This is something that I personally can totally relate to. History is not comprised of good guys or bad guys. That's way too simplistic. So that takes us to the main portion of what I've prepared to share with you all today. Oops. Which is the Oakland Redevelopment Agency photography collection. So in 2016, I was contacted by the head archivist at the Hayward Historical Society, who told me that some boxes of photos had been discovered on the 9th floor of City Hall in Oakland. And city officials needed someone to advise them on kind of what they were and what to do with them, how to handle them. And she recommended me, and it was the beginning of what has turned into an ongoing, primarily volunteer project to shepherd this collection to the Oakland History Room. Without going too deep into the collection itself, I will just say that it contains the photographs and marketing materials of the Oakland Redevelopment Agency, documents that really kind of capture the harsh transformation of Oakland neighborhoods in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Not to be terribly nepotistic, but if you are interested in learning about the collection in particular and Oakland's redevelopment history, I just put a link in here, and I think Dorothy was going to share it, to a photo essay that I published in Places Journal in January 2019 with lots of that information, because I'm not going to cover it today. So the Oakland Redevelopment Agency photography collection, I'm wishing we had given that a shorter name, it's a mouthful, documents Oakland's historic arc of redevelopment from 1960 to 2000. It contains tens of thousands of photographs taken by development agency staff, and the early photos are meticulously labeled and organized. As I was processing the collection, certain figures showed up again and again, faces and photographs, names and meeting minutes and such. And I used this particular clipping, which is from an agency annual report, as a guide as I began to go through the same process I described of memorizing faces in the photos, identifying who everybody is. And I began to hone in really on, frankly, the two people in this story that are not white men. And that's Lillian Q. Love, who you see here, and John B. Williams. So Lillian Love and John Williams are actually perfect foils for telling the story of Oakland's redevelopment during the 60s and 70s. Williams was the head of the Redevelopment Agency, and he was a transplant from Cleveland who came to Oakland in 1964 specifically for this job. An interview I found with his wife, produced shortly after his death in 1976, states that the reason they had moved to Oakland was because of the lack of opportunity for advancement that he faced in Cleveland, where he worked in the Department of Urban Renewal and Housing for 9 years. His wife is quoted as saying that in Cleveland in 1964, Black people weren't heading up agencies, even though he was doing all the work. Lillian Love was born in Texas, but her family moved to Oakland when she was a small child. She was a fierce community defender who, among other things, headed the Oak Center Neighborhood Association, which took on not only the Oakland Redevelopment Agency, but also the Federal Housing Administration in a fight to save her neighborhood from redevelopment. She cited her father as her inspiration. He had unsuccessfully fought the displacement of his family and his home in the 1930s, when the Peralta Village public housing complex was developed or proposed for development. Love herself joined the Oakland Redevelopment Commission in 1966 and served as an officer on the commission until 1970. But I didn't know anything about them. I didn't know any of this when I started processing this collection, and very little information was actually available. When I Googled for Williams, all I got over and over again was reference to this piece of the 980, which is named after him. The Oakland History Room has biographical files for people important to Oakland history, but there was no record for either Williams or Love in there. So I basically was starting from scratch. I contacted AMLO, the African American Museum and Library of Oakland, to ask if they had records on Williams or Love. And the archivist at the time, he's not there anymore, when I called him, he said to me, he was like, "Oh, John B. Williams, we don't have a file on him, but that name sounds familiar." And I was like, "That's because you're located like right on the John B. Williams freeway. Like literally right there." So John B. Williams' name was not ringing any bells in 2017 when I started this research. Amazingly, AMLO did have a file on Love. It contained 2 documents, a program for choir performance from 1944, not very helpful, and a 1975 nomination form for recognition by the East Bay Negro Historical Society. The latter was a real boon because not only did it have the information for which her nomination was justified, but her resume was attached. And what it showed was that aside of her work as a teacher and a social worker and co-owner of a furniture business with her husband, Lillian Love's resume was majority voluntary service. And I think that's something that's really important to highlight, that it's not always the work we get paid for or the work we do to pay the bills that defines us, but the work that we dedicate ourselves to with our heart and soul, which she did. Her resume is 3 pages long, and minus the first couple of lines on the very first page, it is all about her volunteer work. To understand Lillian's roots a bit better, I used OPL's Ancestry.com account to do some genealogical research. The great thing about using Ancestry, if you can get access to it, is that often other people have already done a lot of the work for you and you can access it, such as this family tree that I found Lillian on. I will say though, Ancestry is prohibitively expensive. And even though most public libraries have accounts that you can access, if you're inside the library, I really kind of hate Ancestry and recommend Family Search, which is not quite as thorough and not as well designed, but it's free. And I think that public records should always be free. Through both of these databases, you can access census records. And these can tell you so much about somebody. So searching under Love's maiden name, which is Menoweather, I was able to pull the 1930 census, which shows Lillian's family living with her maternal grandparents and 2 of her mother's brothers at 1003 Poplar Street in Oakland. It's probably impossible for you to see this on this screen, but Lillian's maternal grandfather, Henry Rice, owned the house, which is no small feat for a Black man born in Texas in 1862. The kind of information that they gathered on the census back then too is really interesting. Like they note that he does not own a radio. Like he owns the house, but he doesn't own a radio. Today, that address is smack in the middle of what is now Peralta Village. So that corroborates with Lillian's story about the loss of her family home. The 1940 census shows that Lillian's father now owns the home, though it also says that the address is now 1023 Poplar and that he was born in Illinois instead of Texas. So one thing to keep in mind is that census data can be incredibly inaccurate and should be taken with a grain of salt. I was able to pull up Meriwether, Lillian's father's 1942 draft card, which now says that they live at 1033 Poplar, as do multiple city directories, which I also checked the family's addresses against. A couple things could be happening here. Address numbers did sometimes change. Lots could also be subdivided and new addresses created. I did wonder if maybe Lillian's grandfather had subdivided his property and let his children build their own houses on it. This research is totally possible to do looking through property records and things like Sanborn fire maps, but it's not really the information that I was after. It's really hard to not get bogged down by details like this when you're researching, but I was trying to stay really focused on what it was that I was looking for, which is stuff about Lillian. So I went back and pulled up voter registration records, noting that the 1033 Poplar Street address, again, is the primary one the family's listing. And really interestingly, Lillian, under her maiden name, is listed as a stenographer and a Democrat in the 1938 voters' records. In 1944, she's listed at the same address under her new married name, and she's now a housewife and a Republican. Lillian became a staunch Republican throughout the rest of her life and would actually later serve as a campaign manager for John Reading's winning run against Black Panther Party leader Bobby Seale in 1973. That's just a little footnote on where her politics went. I found her husband, William Love's 1940 draft registration card, and you can see here that he lists initially 1033 Poplar as his address, but then on the sides, penciled in are 2 amendments to his address. So people are very mobile. Local newspaper searches are also incredibly helpful. I don't know if it has to do with, pre-internet. People got in the news for all kinds of things back in the day, but Lillian Love was actually an incredibly active community member. And so, if there was a project threatening her neighborhood, she was speaking out about it. If there was a resource being withheld from her community, she was speaking out about it. This here is a newspaper clipping at the groundbreaking of the Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School in West Oakland. That's her as the MC at a podium. And this actually dovetailed really nicely with the collection as I was organizing it, because there's also extensive documentation in the Oakland Redevelopment Agency collection of this project, the elementary school. So here's Lillian Love on the left, along with 2 redevelopment officers and some residents and children from West Oakland, and a maquette of the school project for the groundbreaking of MLK School. Of course, obituaries are a great resource when you're doing a biographical sketch. It's probably a good idea to start research with obituaries, but you have to keep in mind that they tell you how this person wanted to be remembered. This obituary is totally fascinating to me because it very clearly says that Lillian Love challenged the redevelopment agency originally because she didn't believe in public housing. It actually says in her obituary that she believed that public housing was degrading to the individual and that she challenged liberal Democrats with her Republican credo of self-reliance. Switching gears to John B. Williams. Primary sources for Williams were a bit harder to track down, but there were quite a few lengthy obituaries on him, as well as this really interesting article that was published in the California Voice in 1988, which is a full 12 years after his death. And this article poses a question which I found myself pondering in 2018, which was, why had John B. Williams been forgotten? During his 12 years as executive director of the Oakland Redevelopment Agency, Williams oversaw the development of housing projects in West Oakland, East Oakland, Chinatown, the development of City Center, Oakland, Chinatown's Pacific Renaissance Plaza, and Laney College. He was one of the founders of the New Oakland Committee, which strove to bring together labor, business, and minority groups. He was the first Oakland City official to implement a diversity program to ensure city contracts went to minority contractors, and the first to enforce minority training and hiring programs on Oakland Redevelopment Agency projects. He was also part of the group which established the first enterprise bank, FDIC 14300, the first and only minority-owned bank in Northern California, which was established in 1972 and closed in 1985. When he died, John B. Williams was considered one of the most powerful Black men in Oakland. Lionel Wilson, Oakland's first Black mayor, said in his oral history that before his own nomination and subsequent election in 1977, Williams had been considered the likely candidate to be Oakland's first Black mayor. I'd be curious to know how many people recognize this sculpture, assuming most people on this Zoom are in Oakland or at least the Bay Area. I literally walked by it at least 3 times a week for much of my adult life and never really registered its existence until I started working on this collection. This newspaper clipping you see on the left is from the Oakland Tribune when in 1987, this bust was installed at City Center Plaza in memory of John B. Williams. That's his widow, Velena, at the, whatever you call it when you, when you set up a monument. The dedication, that's it. And then to the right is just a picture today. And people walk in and out of 12th Street Station all day past this. I mentioned that I couldn't find many primary resources on Williams, but I'll share a couple of things that I did find that I just personally found really interesting. So I found him in the 1940 census, living at home with his parents and his siblings. He is listed as a 4th-year college student and a government worker and art teacher. I know that he received a BFA in Fine Arts from the Cleveland Institute of Art in 1939 because I found the obituary that the school published in their annual report after he died. I also found his draft card from 1940. He served in the US Army from 1944 to 1946. I know that at the time he registered for war, he stood 5'11.5" and weighed 169 pounds. It's weird how intimate this information becomes. I guess what I'm saying is that you begin to really humanize people when you research them like this, when you get all these little details, when you see them write their mother's name of their next of kin on their draft card. One of the things that I came across in my research was the obituary for his father, Reverend Edward Nichols Williams, a Mississippi native who graduated from theological school at Morehouse College in 1914. Reverend Williams also died at the relatively young age of 59. That's how old John B. Williams was when he died, also after a sudden and short illness. The obituary mentions that the night after he died, a pencil sketch of him was drawn by one of his sons, John, a graduate of the Cleveland School of Art. It's really interesting to me how no one really wants to touch on remembering John B. Williams. I'm guessing because all these years later, the legacy of redevelopment agencies is largely a negative one. Since I started working on this collection, it's been referenced and the photos have been reproduced in a handful of really great articles about Oakland's history of redevelopment, gentrification, and displacement. And in most instances, people get sort of caught up on these binaries of redevelopment bad, community resistance good, but I think it's really not that simple. This article by Zach Haber for the Oakland Post last year does a good job of pointing out that Williams actually collaborated with Love and the Oak Center Neighborhood Association. He gives Williams some credit for establishing and enforcing the city's first minority training and hiring policies. Meanwhile, referring to Lilly and Love as a housing activist should get teased out a bit. She was a housing activist for people who already owned their homes. it's pretty challenging to try to draw a narrative arc from Williams and Love to where we are today, with the housing and homelessness Oakland is experiencing in tandem with rampant condo development across our skyline. But that is a whole nother topic. So Dorothy, I put in a break here if we want to do Q&A about this particular part of the presentation or collections.
Yes, I would love to stop a bit and back up a little bit and talk about some of the things you've pointed out. First I want to say, just to add to what you've said about how delving into the genealogical or biological research of particular individuals in our history and in our communities really kind of humanizes them and makes historic research just so much more approachable and interesting and complicated. And what I always strive to do is to find how we can complicate these stories, because we so often, you just recently said, there's this dichotomy between how we view redevelopment and what makes the story that you're telling tonight so intriguing to me. And you and I have had many conversations in the Oakland History room about redevelopment, because you shepherded those pictures to the Oakland History Center. Connecting redevelopment and a redevelopment agency with Black people, and not just as the victims of redevelopment, but connecting it with the administrators in a redevelopment agency, that complicates the story of redevelopment and how Oakland really changed. And there were people who were, on the redevelopment agency board who we don't know their stories. Like you say, we've all walked past that statue untold number of times. Who was John Williams? So it was really important that when you brought those pictures to us, to see how engaged these two African-American people and possibly many others were in getting those kind of more modern 1970s era housing developments built, as well as City Center. They were all involved in that too. So I just think it's really interesting how complex a fuller story can be. I also think it's interesting that you have included a picture of Miss Oakland, which I think the woman featured in the picture, I think they're on Broadway. And she has this big bouquet
for people.
Yeah, she has a big bouquet of flowers. And, we were just, me and my coworker, Ron Heckert, were just in conversation about, because we're processing right now the Junior Chamber of Commerce collection in the Oakland History Center. And he brings to me the other day a Jet magazine. For those of you who don't know, Jet magazine is a African-American, very many decades old African-American, what would we call it? A magazine, but a little tiny magazine. And the Chamber of Commerce had sponsored the Miss Oakland pageant. I know I'm getting off on a tangent here, but they sponsored the Miss Oakland pageant. But after 3 successive years of Miss Oakland being African-American, the one selected being the African-American, they stopped giving the pageant, which I just thought was just strange. Anyway, she's there with Mr. Redevelopment, John B. Williams, and some other people. Anyway, I just want to.
Can I point out something about one picture also to all of you? Yes. I'm going to make you dizzy by scrubbing backwards really fast through all these slides. But
yes.
This picture, can you see my cursor? Sorry, yes, I can't tell what people. Okay, so you know who this is right here that I'm circling around in this photograph. This is the groundbreaking for Acorn.
Is that guy. Joshua Rose?
That is Robert C. Weaver. This is another case of like I have become a human facial recognition machine around certain people.
He was the head of HUD, yes?
He was the very first head of HUD. He was also the very first cabinet member, African-American cabinet member, right? In
yes.
US history. So African-American history and redevelopment are incredibly intertwined and complicated. And I do think it's important, like you say, to sort of try and break away from this binary narrative of like redevelopment was something that people of color were all the victims of. Yeah, redevelopment was terrible and it did terrible things to many, many communities. But and this is something that I'm trying to flesh out more and more in my research is like, I look at someone like John B. Williams, right? And I've done research about his history and his own experiences and really like his philosophies and his ideals for what he was doing. And I think we have to get away from the idea that everybody involved in these schemes were out to destroy communities. I do think, you know, and especially, it's evidenced in the work that he did in terms of developing all of these minority training programs and implementing these early expectations for hiring and stuff like that within the ORA. I do think there are people who actually did believe that they were doing the right thing for communities, people who really thought that progress really did mean blank white architecture and harsh, you know, 90-degree angles and all of the things that like modernism was going to promise people that they thought was going to somehow lift communities out of poverty. I think it's a very, very complicated history. And I don't think we do ourselves favors by creating these polar narratives, because then what are we going to learn from that? And what are we going to walk forward with?
Yes. So I want to, since we're going to break here for this first half, or maybe more than half, I just wanted to find out if anybody had any questions so far that they can put in the chat. Anybody? Or say out loud, unmute yourselves. Anyone? Okay, well, let's carry on, Mariah.
Okay, let me scrub through my slides again.
One of the things that I noticed in your Takahashi collection, the Yabukis were there. Dean Yabuki is one of our, I can't call him a regular patron, but someone who regularly comes to the Oakland History Center, and also who was a member of the Oakland Heritage Alliance. He comes in often and sits and goes through our Oakland Japanese photo collection and identifies people, you know, family, friends, distant relatives of the Yabuki family. And I noticed that the Takahashi collection at San Francisco Public is part of that. So Dean Yabuki is great in identifying, because he has a very long history, his family does, here in Oakland. And is connected to so many different families. So he's a great resource. He isn't always in Oakland. He lives elsewhere, like I think in another country, part of the year. So yeah, I noticed his name on one of the scrapbooks that you mentioned in this collection.
Cool. I actually didn't catch that. So you just made a whole new connection that could reopen that whole project.
For sure.
I'm going to answer a really quick question that Jean just put in the chat right before I switch back to present, which he asked how many of the photos from the Oakland Redevelopment Agency collection were in the cabinets outside of Anna Lee Allen's next to her desk. We don't even have a solid count, Jean, on how many photographs it is, because we have only really measured them by linear foot and then tried to do guesses. If you'd ever been inside the 9th floor of City Hall before they redesigned it, there was an area next to Annalie's office, which is also where the copier was. And there were a bunch of file cabinets, and then there were a bunch of shelves, and they were all packed with boxes of photographs. There's tens of thousands, there might be hundreds of thousands. And we did not take them all to the Oakland History Room. Dorothy was very clear about that. We had to, I spent probably the first 3 or 4 months trying to make selections of what absolutely had to get moved. And it was all mostly the older photographs over to the Oakland History Room. And I believe that the rest of the photographs were moved into the basement of City Hall, but maybe somebody else knows. Okay, should I talk about this collection now?
Yes, let's continue.
All right. So the Kazumi Takahashi collection, which I talked about a little bit earlier in my intro, came to the San Francisco Public Library as a donation from a bookseller who had acquired it as in an estate sale. The history room was interested in the collection because it clearly contained photographs of Japanese Americans who lived in San Francisco before and after World War II. But that is basically all we knew about it when we started, or when I started on it. Processing orphan collections is a lot like doing private eye work. You're supposed to figure out who these people were, what is the story of their lives, and how is that significant to the larger story of American history. I love this photo. You see the little kids like photobombing from behind. To me, it is incredibly important that we do everything we can to shed light on the stories of the historically underrepresented in American history, and that we create new sources which speak from their perspective. I started with this collection by sorting the photographs by shape, color, and size. This helped me get them into somewhat chronological order, and then I looked for clues which were sometimes written on the backs of photos or included in the photo albums in the collection. I amazingly was able to use the Google Translate app on my phone to translate texts that were in Japanese written on the backs of photographs. And then I did just a huge amount of this genealogical research to figure out who these photos were. So born in San Francisco to Japanese parents, both Kazumi Takahashi and Masuko Ota were interred at Tule Lake, then at Topaz War Relocation Center between 1942 and 1945. There is an 11-year age difference between them, so I'm guessing that they met in the camps. There are no photographs in the collection of the two of them together before 1945, I'd say. The collection contains the yearbook of Margaret, or Maggie as she's known, from high school in San Francisco, as well as a junior high school graduation certificate for Kaz, as Kazumi was known, from the junior high school at the Topaz internment camp. Interestingly, the collection contains signed photographs from both Japanese and Japanese American soldiers, which really speaks to the complexity of these women's experience and allegiances during World War II. There are no photographs from their period of internment, as cameras were not allowed in the camps. Kaz's graduation certificate from Topaz is the only direct reference to the internment in the collection, but I was able to cross-reference the War Relocation Authority records to confirm that both women were interned at the same camps at the same time. After the war ended and Japanese Americans were released from the camps, like many Japanese Americans returning to the West Coast, they found their homes occupied by migrants from the South who had moved to take war jobs. These two women, along with many other Japanese Americans, moved to Hunters Point in San Francisco and lived in temporary housing, which had been constructed for shipyard workers during the war effort. Kaz went on to graduate from George Washington High School in San Francisco in 1947. So I showed you this before, but here you can see Maggie and Kaz. They're both to the far right in this photo from 1952.
And there's Dean Yabuki as the baby.
Oh, he's the baby. Oh man,
Dean Yabuki.
I should share this with you so you can share it with him, because I'm not sure that he knows about this collection.
I'd be surprised if he didn't, but certainly I would love to share this with him.
He might be able to actually really help figure out a bunch of things. I don't know, because I can't see who's on here. Christina Moretta, the photo curator from SFPL, oversaw my processing this and was going to try and join us today. I'm not sure that this finding aid is live yet. So that would be a really interesting thing to figure out. Cool. So, oh yeah, so I learned through Ancestry that Kaz married, let me see, where is it? He married a man named Franklin Watanabe in 1958. There's a letter in the collection from Frank to Kaz in 1957 where he's saying he wants to announce their engagement. And there's also, I don't know if I should say this, an unfinished, unsigned breakup letter in the same box from her. So you could kind of use your imagination. But then there's Polaroid photographs of Frank and Kaz's wedding in which Maggie appears by her side as the maid of honor. Kaz and Frank then relocated to Southern California, which is sort of where this collection ends. The couple had one son who I did try to trace. I think it's important to try and contact the families of Orphaned Collections, but I didn't have any luck finding him. I do know, because I found her death certificate, that Kaz died in 2007. I don't know anything about what happened to Maggie. I like to believe that their friendship, this incredible bond that was born under the duress of the internment camps, outlived their marriages. The fact that when Kaz died and her photographs ended up in a public auction, Maggie's personal photos and albums were mixed in with hers makes me think that maybe they came back together later in life. That the story didn't end in 1958. I'd like to return to the collection and do a deeper dive and write that history. And maybe, Dorothy, now you've given me a lead to be able to start this, go deeper into this project again.
Dean Yabuki is an incredible collector and preservationist of Japanese American history in the Bay Area. His family was very well connected. He's given us just gobs of photos, and he has stood very patiently and excitedly, actually, to identify each person and their relationships to each of the other people in the photos, their wedding photos, and just casual pictures of families together in their houses that he's given to the Oakland History Center. And he's also tried to connect us and has connected us with other people in the Japanese American community to encourage them to also donate if they are willing to their photos too. He really wants to preserve that history of that community.
Well, you definitely need to connect us to each other.
Yeah, for sure.
Show him this picture that he's a baby in. That's amazing.
Yes, that's so funny.
Okay, so the last collection that I'm going to share with you, also from SFPL, is the Lilly Mae King Ransom Family Collection. I like this photograph as a way to segue between these two projects because, as I'm sure you know, when San Francisco's Japanese Americans were forced into the camps, their homes and businesses were largely reoccupied by African American migrants from the South. And this class photo from a San Francisco elementary school in 1952 shows a predominantly African American class with two Japanese American girls whose families must have found a way back into the community once the war ended. So if you look in the back row on the right, you see Lawrence Ransom, who is the youngest of the four sons of Lilly Mae King. Not to be mixed up with Lilly and Q Love. I'm going to write a whole book on the Lilly and Lilly leaders of the world. Raised in San Francisco's Fillmore district, Jesse Jr., Leonard, Christopher, and Lawrence Ransom were members of the Knights of Peter Claver, dedicated Boy Scouts, track stars, choir boys, spelling bee champions, and all of this was with due credit to their mother, Lilly Mae King. Lilly Mae King was born in Texas in 1920 and moved to San Francisco as a young girl. I showed you all the class photo at the beginning of the presentation that she's in. She graduated from San Francisco's Girls High School in 1937 and met a sailor named Jesse Ransom, who appears in some snapshots and on birth certificates, but seems to have mostly disappeared from the family before Lawrence's birth. She worked as a nurse and as an apartment building manager and was secretary for the Western Addition Community Organization, known as WACO. This organization fought the city of San Francisco's Redevelopment Agency in an effort to stop the displacement of Fillmore residents as the area underwent aggressive redevelopment. On December 26, 1968, WACO filed a lawsuit against the agency, the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, which actually resulted in the withholding of federal funding until a satisfactory relocation plan was in place for community residents. At the time, Lilly Mae King was widely recognized for her advocacy and community organizing work, specifically regarding impact of redevelopment on her neighborhood. On March 19, 1986, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors sent this letter to Lawrence, letting him know that they had adjourned their regular meeting out of respect to the memory of his mother. Lilly Mae King had died of a heart attack a week earlier at the age of 66. Lawrence died 12 years later at Leland House, a Catholic shelter for the chronically homeless, and a single jumbled banker's box of his belongings was later donated to the library, primarily because of the documentation in it, which contained relics of Lilly Mae's work with WACO. The box included Lilly Mae's communications, rosters of WACO members, community organizing materials, tax documents, meeting minutes, zoning study plans, and the organizational ledger. One of the things that I really love to point out, let me see if I can find it, under the expenditures, if you can see where my mouse is, as here you can see that WACO made a donation of $100 to Cesar Chavez. This is December 1968, I believe. No, August 1968. So this is like at the peak of the farmers boycott, the UFW boycott. So I like to look at this and I like to think of like, when you think like, oh, this little donation that I'm making to this cause, does it really make a difference? I like to look at this and think like, yeah, it does, it does. The collection also included personal items like her ration book from World War II, her son's birth and baptism certificates or copies of, their well baby books, their report cards. There's endless documentation of their childhood and high school years. Lilly Mae was a diligent conservator of her son's histories. The irony that Lilly Mae's youngest son died in a homeless shelter was not lost on me. And the possibility that the history of Lilly Mae King and everything that she stood for may have faded out of memory in that shelter too horrified me. One of my main goals in organizing this collection and writing the archival description for it was to balance my attention towards Lilly Mae's role as a community activist and as a mother. We are so accustomed to seeing these American histories that are comprised of these like spectacular individual heroes and built on American exceptionalism, but in truth, I believe that American history is largely the result of collective action of ordinary people and that our archives should reflect that. So I do know that this finding aid is live and hopefully people have begun to access it. You can access it through OAC or searching through SFPL's database. But yeah. That's it for the other two.
That's incredible. That's incredible work. And I just want to say to everybody that Mariah calling this work detective work is not an exaggeration. It's actually one of the most fun parts of my job is to try to figure out how we place these items that come to us, you know, in a very willy-nilly kind of way. You know, oftentimes I'm just given a box of something because someone has died. And it does take, first of all, some compassion to see that there is cultural and historic value in these materials, even if they're not people who held political office or not people who were born of well-titled or well-placed families or rich families. But what's so fun about the work, for those of you who are interested in archival work, is piecing together clues from the photos as they are. Maybe a car will help you date a thing. Maybe clothing will help you date an image. Maybe a street sign in the background, kind of insignificantly or just haphazardly captured in the background, will let you know what area of town you're looking at. So it is a lot of detective work. It can be an awful lot of fun when you are dealing with Sanborn maps or having to go to the city directories to find out what people did. How do we place these people in history? So I appreciate your work, Mariah. And if you could, I'd like to ask you a few questions about how you got involved in archival work to begin with.
Yeah, in a very weird sideways way. I was for many years the youth programs director at the Bay Area Video Coalition. My background is actually in youth media. And BAVAC had a preservation department and lost the head of the preservation department. And I ended up, nonprofit style, like, well, now I'll just head two totally different departments. While I was overseeing the preservation department, I learned a lot about audiovisual preservation and started working with a lot of BAVAC's clients, which were a lot of archives. I worked with the Fales Library out of New York, worked with SFPL. I got to know archives, and I realized how much I loved archives and archival work, and decided to pursue that as sort of a new field for myself. And the thing that I definitely recognized with one foot in preservation and the other in archiving is that preservation is really all about, like, how do we save the vehicle? How do we make sure that this physical thing still works? And what I really cared about was storytelling and the stories. And so that's why I'm now studying public history, but still working as an archivist.
Good. Oh, now you've gone all over the country doing these trainings of the trainers, helping communities identify and preserve their material. Would you say that there's a lot of support for community-based archiving, particularly in communities of color?
Historically, no, but there definitely is more and more so. Mellon Foundation has a huge initiative around community archives right now. People define what a community archive is very differently in different places, but I feel like it's something that is really building momentum right now. The work that I do with Community Archiving Workshop is really focused on helping communities who have collections. A lot of times collections just grow naturally because your church or your organization has video cameras and you've been documenting all of these events. And 30 years later, these are now, we recognize, historically really important events, and you have the documentation of it. Really what we try to do is help communities learn to care for and process their collections themselves and make decisions about whether or not they can care for it. A lot of small organizations think that the only thing that they can do with their archive is donate it to save it to somebody else. And that often means taking a collection away from the community who produced it and making it inaccessible to the people who it's most important to. So that is really the crux of our work in terms of community archives. But yeah, I do feel like I see more and more sort of momentum around knowledge sharing so that people learn how to maintain these things within their own communities. And I see more and more foundational support for allowing and supporting people in doing that.
And what do you think is the inspiration for that growing support that you're seeing now? What do you think inspired that?
I think one, people have seen it done well in instances. And I think two, we're seeing with the exception of some really large institutions, we're starting to see the typical institutions that served as archives starting to flounder. We have universities that are no longer focusing on their archives and collecting, and are actually beginning to deaccession collections, which is quite shocking for people to see, that a collection that's been donated is now being disposed of. I think that might be a lot of it, actually, is just getting away from the concept that archives belong in, you know, storied institutions that have bell towers and stuff in them.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to know, well, you said different communities respond in different ways. Can you give us like a couple of examples of how communities have responded to, you know, salvaging, preserving their archives or not? I mean, what have been some of the arguments for or against?
I'll tell you one that just comes straight to mind because it's where my head is at right now. I'm currently working, Community Archiving Workshop got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to bring our workshop to tribal and indigenous archives. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we haven't been able to go do the work, but we've started doing it remotely through Zoom. And I've been meeting with a lot of the indigenous archivists that I'm going to be working with in the last couple of weeks. And there's one group that I had a meeting with last week who were explaining to me that their tribe, a lot of tribal and indigenous archives hold recordings that were produced by like anthropologists or like documentary makers and stuff like that, and have the recordings have been repatriated to the community. So the community have these recordings that they didn't make, maybe that they shouldn't, these recordings shouldn't have been made, but now they have them. And the people that I was talking to were explaining to me that their tribe had actually disbanded in the 1930s because of a drought. There was an extended drought in their community, and people actually disbanded and joined different regional tribes. And there was a whole generation which was born and began growing up in other tribes speaking other languages. And it wasn't until the 1950s that they actually returned to their own land and community. And there's a huge push to try to revive their language because there was a loss of language during that 20-year period. And those recordings that they have repatriated actually are going to help create an opportunity for that to happen.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I think so. I was thrilled.
And can you say the name of the tribe?
I honestly, the only reason I can't, there's not like a protective reason I can't, I'm forgetting which one it was because I talked to like 7 different people that week or 7 different tribes. So I would have to look at my notes to tell you, but it's in the Southwest. I'm doing a whole project in the Southwest corridor right now. So it was either New Mexico, Arizona, or Oklahoma. I would have to honestly look at my notes.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a question that's a little kooky, but if there was anything that in the world that you could save and archive, what would it be if money was no expense at all?
Anything?
And time.
What?
Well, yeah, just anything. I don't want to limit you.
I mean, this isn't quite the answer you're looking for, but I'll tell you the sort of like keeps an audiovisual archivist awake at night. I wish that somebody would invent a machine that can scan magnetic media because people don't realize that like videotapes are actually much more endangered than film. You know, people think because film is older that film is a bigger issue, but film is a stable medium that you can always like hold it up and look through it through light and see the image. But magnetic media depends on this technology that's disappearing. And there are formats where there's not very many players anymore. And there are so many recordings in the world. There are so many recordings that we haven't played back yet or digitized or know how essential or important they are. And if I could do anything, if like I had like one, you know, AV archivist wish, it would be for somebody to invent something that can actually read magnetic media without
Without a VHS player.
Yeah, any of it.
Mariah, can you tell our guests tonight, can you describe for them a typical CAW? You know, what the participants learn to do and the processes that they're introduced to in a typical CAW?
Yeah, and you can pipe in because you've participated in one.
I have.
Basically, a CAW is when we partner with an organization that has an AV collection that is what we call unprocessed, which means we're not entirely sure what it is. We don't have an inventory. We're not sure what condition the collection's in. And CAW members, who are all AV archivists, partner with that organization's staff, volunteers from their community, and we teach them. We have a real quick slideshow that we do that teaches people how to, recognize different audiovisual formats. And then we sit down together and it's like data entry. We essentially pull out all the boxes of material and we start inputting, creating an inventory or a spreadsheet that captures all of the information off the labels of the recordings and the formats of the recordings. Film, we set up a thing and we teach people, though we end up doing a lot of it. We rewind the film and we repair the film. We repair like bad splices and things like that. But I mean, you've done it. It's a work day. It's like a solid work day. We don't let people leave for lunch breaks. We always have them catered because we don't like people to leave the room for fear that they won't come back because we work everybody so much. But what happens is by the end of the day, you have a single inventory for the organization that documents their entire collection, that has all of the information from the labels, that captures as well as we can without playing the media what content is in the collection. And we highlight the things that are at the greatest risk so that they can prioritize for preservation.
That is all of what we did. And it is like a work day. I participated in a CAW. I want to say it was 2019. Could have been 2018, but I'm thinking it was 2019. And I was joining Sean Dickerson because the CAW, both Sean Dickerson is the acting archivist of the African American Museum and Library in Oakland, which is part of the Oakland Public Library system. And so he and I went up to Sacramento to spend a few days learning how to help our community members preserve their materials. So at the call we were participating in, we were at the Sacramento Public Library, their main library, in their history room. The Sacramento room is what it's called. And we had these collections of albums and video and audio cassette tapes and things like that, just boxes and boxes of this collection belonging to Sacramento room. And we went through it and we were collecting all the metadata, which for those of you not in this field, it's information about the information, who's the producer, how long a tape is it? And the challenge is you can't stick it into a machine and play it because a lot of times people find in their collections, they don't have the machinery. And we were invited, I should back up a little bit. We were invited to participate in this call because the Oakland Public Library, our two departments in the Oakland Public Library, both AMLO and the Oakland History Center, are partners in California Revealed, which is a state-funded initiative working to preserve audiovisual medium.
And we're still supposed to do a call with you with OPL.
Yes, we are. But we also have to deal with this pandemic now.
I know.
So it was very instructive, learning to identify, what side of the film the sound track is on, and how to splice film and things like that. It was really, really instructive. A little intimidating because we don't want to mess up anybody's materials, but we learned a lot in those few days. And the lunches were also quite good.
Yes.
So Mariah, do you want to share any other information about your work or future projects or Are you going to come back? I should also say that Mariah was kind of, in a way, interned at the Oakland History Center, in that it took a bit of time for her to not only get the material, the Oakland Redevelopment Agency materials down to us, but put them in some kind of order. So thank you. I want to thank you publicly for doing that work. I totally notice your commitment to it.
And it's not done. It's still not
It's
done.
not done. It's a lot, though. It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's huge.
Yes. So I'm going to check the chat to see where we are with answering any questions. Does anyone have any questions or comments? People are saying, bring on Betamax. Great. Love that magnetic media scanner idea. We have a few folks ready to sign up, Rashid says. Oh, good.
When we do the workshop in OPL, Rashid, we're going to call on you for your volunteers.
And then again, I want to say California Revealed is a state initiative that can help your community organizations preserve their archives. And then I think there also has to be some kind of recalibration of what we think of as archives. A lot of times, if things are generated by a family or an individual who's not connected to the academy, we can think that it doesn't have any cultural value or any informational value. And I think we really have to work as a society to kind of shift that, because all of those great history books are kind of built on those little bitty stories. You know, I mean, think of Ken Burns documentaries. I mean, what he's doing is just building story after story after story and using individuals' photographs and records and so forth. So, Mariah, you bring it home.
Well, I just want to answer, Tricia had a question about approaching family archives. Not my thing at all, but I will say there used to be an annual conference, and I know it happened in San Francisco a few times, the Internet Archive, called Personal Digital Archiving. And they put up extensive documentation that you can probably find on the internet that's all about people who are trying to deal with family collections, and they focus on really like accessible resources and accessible workflows. So I would look there.
And also, was it Tricia who had that question? Yeah, Tricia. Mm-hmm. There are also Family Tree is putting out books now on how to preserve your records once you find them, how to preserve your family photos and so forth. I'll try to put that in the chat before we end tonight. Any other
Tricia,
questions?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to pop in and fill in the blanks here. So my question is really, you know, my mother is 82 and I am now the trustee of her estate. And I was going through her security deposit box recently with her to inventory it. And I photographed everything, and, you know, I plan to make a spreadsheet of its contents. My mom is a really incredible archivist herself. So she has documentation of when she came over from the Philippines. She was maybe 9 years old, and she didn't have any paperwork attached to her. And the corporation, the Hawaii Planters Association in Hawaii that my grandfather worked for, had to vouch for her identity. So she has the piece of paper that, you know, served basically as her passport paper or visa or whatever you want to call it, in the absence of ID. So, you know, I kind of feel like there's a bigger story to tell there, and I'm not quite sure like what I'm looking at, or, you know, whether it plugs into an archive that's existing. I mean, I'm looking, she's an incredible archivist. How do I even begin to approach this ephemera, like to organize it? And, you know, where do you start? That's really my question.
Is the question about preserving the physical object or about using it as sort of a launching pad for finding more information?
I think it's the latter. I mean, because she's done a great job of preserving it. It's been in a safe deposit box for 40 plus years. So it's in fine condition, but it's really about like, how do I, as the future caretaker of this archive, really begin to study it and begin to understand and begin to, kind of chart, like, I guess like spreadsheets, or like, what's the kind of framework and infrastructure that you use to, that kind of supports the research that you're doing as you begin to dive into these archives. Like when you looked at that, family archive that you were just the Japantown one in San Francisco, how did you start? What did you just call it photo one, photo two?
Totally. I mean, it was like, I think the yearbook with Maggie Ota's name, that gave me actually a sense of how old she was, because I figure out, you graduate from high school when you're 17 or 18. I just started plugging her name into search fields. And honestly, I know I'm like, I hate Ancestry, but like Ancestry works really well for stuff like this, because it's connected to the National Archives. They've done a lot to make sure that they have pretty exclusive access to all of our historical records. And if you have somebody's, close enough, like approximate full name, birth dates, and birth location, it will begin to generate a lot of information for you. I bet anything that your mom's records are tied and available online through these national databases.
Okay, thanks.
I know you. I can help you with it. She's all pretending to be like just some random person in the thing. Rashid had a question that I'm really curious about, but Rashid, could you pop on and say your question and sort of explain it?
Sure. So, Peace, thank you. It's nice to finally meet you. Dorothy actually shared your piece in Places with me and was extremely excited about it a few years ago. And that, Dorothy, that may have been close to the last time I got to see you in 3D. Yeah, I'll share a little bit, and I'm trying to be mindful of how I'll speak about it. So I live in a city that does not have a history of, well, let me say, the historical institutions do not have a history of being concerned with or preserving the stories of non-white folks. And I've been doing some of that work, and I'm interested in like hearing like what might be strategies for one, pushing those institutions, working with those institutions, but yeah, that's the first question. So, and I can be more specific and say which board I just got on, but nah, I don't want to do all that because it's recorded.
I think, the thing that's going to immediately get attention and support is just to do it really well yourself. One of the things that I always say in terms of an argument for preservation at all is as soon as you can make the outcome of preservation visible, people get really fired up about it. So this is, I'm usually speaking about like AV materials. Like once you digitize one recording and you do a screening of it and people see it, then they begin to realize what is possible and how rich all of these documents and resources are. And so I think really advocating for the history of the community that you are talking about is beginning to actually share it, honestly, like as soon as, if it's something that you believe in, as soon as you show that and you share it and you do that with pride, those institutions are going to want that to be theirs. And you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be questioning. I don't know. I'm going to not know anything about where you are, what institutions we're talking about. But, there's been like a reverse process that I've been seeing, which is really interesting, which is communities of color going into civic archives and demanding the materials to take out and bring it and to create their own archives and their own museums and their own spaces. Because you have instances where communities are documented in collections and institutions that in no way serve that community, and so those become dead documents.
Yeah, Rashid, one thing you have to, I would say one thing, Rashid, you have to remember that the exclusion of story is part of the story. That is part of your story. The exclusion from the community narrative or the official narrative of a city, a town, an organization, a school is part of the story. So don't leave that out. You know, and your journey to try to find information about whatever it is you're seeking. If there is a lack of information, a block to that information that you're encountering when you go to seek that information, that is also part of your story. I think what's been interesting in reading histories that are being currently written, recently written, is that people are incorporating into their historic narratives the process by which they could tell this story.
Yeah.
Thank
you for that. And I think, I'm sorry, Mariah, we're gonna add something.
No, go. I'm looking for a resource I want to share with you. So say what you're going to say.
Yeah, right on. No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Jean. Yeah, Jean created a wiki for me to do on this city or some time ago, and I have not taken up on that writing, that epic writing task. You know, the other thing you mentioned were people going into, you know, I'll say the archives, right? These more official, institutionally backed archives and reclaiming those. And the other thing I think about, I worry about, is for those that have, you know, more unstable housing situations. So like, I have a archive here, but, you know, I'm a month out from, you know, missing, you know, well, we had an eviction moratorium right now, right? But post-COVID, missed the rent, I'm in court. So I'm curious about the opportunities for those who have, you know, housing insecurity or vulnerabilities, you know, how we can, you know, actually build and sustain a place as an archive.
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, that's such a good question. And that speaks to that last collection that I shared Lilly Making collection. You know, that collection came from a homeless shelter. Like her last son died in a homeless shelter, and those were the last belongings he had. He had held on to a single box with those photographs and those documents that she had saved their whole lives. He had kept holding on to them. If you can imagine, this man who was like chronically homeless managed to protect this single box to the day he died. Like, that's kind of the terrible place that we're at, with how precarious some of these collections and some of these histories are. And I don't have an answer for you at all for that, but I recognize your question and the really big issue. I mean, Dorothy, you could probably say, I mean, I think that like people often hope that they can drop things at the library, right?
Oh, well, that is the thing that makes the Oakland History Center's collection so special, is that it's community grown, in that we always, prior to COVID, get donations from people, not only when a relative or friend or neighbor dies, but things that they know that their families don't have interest in preserving. So many people come in, not in distress, but come in and say, my kids aren't interested in these, you know, this collection of yearbooks from our grandparents. Would you like them? Well, certainly. Would you like these photos of a particular event? Certainly. Of course, we do, as a library and a place of finite size, we do have to acknowledge when we can't take something. You know, we were offered a big collection of the Oakland Tribune photos, and we just couldn't take it because we just didn't have the space to accommodate it. But what I did to help is to try to find a place, and unfortunately we did find a place in which to deliver that archive, which is now at the Hayward Area Historical Society. So it does become quite precarious. You know, we had a patron who used to come in, older African-American gentleman, who'd come in and do all this genealogical research every Thursday night. Mr. Roy, his name was Royster Jackson. I won't call his name. And so one night, a woman came in who I didn't know. She wasn't a regular patron. She came in and she told me that Mr. Jackson had died. And she had come to not only tell me this, because she told me he used to talk about me and coming to the Oakland History Center, but she assumed that he had all that research he had been collecting over all those years. She assumed that he had given it to me, to the Oakland History Center, and he had not. And she explained that he had no wife, children, parents, which to leave it to, and the police were kind of clearing out his house. He lived alone, older man, must have been in his 70s, possibly 80s. And so who knows all of what he was collecting. I know one thing she told me that he did do for the West Oakland community is that he would go through just very meticulously the yearbooks, and he would make photocopies of different people and then give those photocopies to those people's kids and grandkids to say, you know, your dad was a track star, your mom was the head of a student body at McClymonds or something like that. And there is a loss for the community when these things, these materials disappear.
I'm going to type into the chat the name of this place, and this speaks to what you're saying too, Dorothy, but Rashid, I think, and I don't know how good their website is, it is a really small museum that I stumbled across totally randomly once, which is honestly the best example I have ever seen in my life of a community archive / museum, and it's in Kentucky. It's called the African American Heritage Center, super generic name, but if you look it up in Franklin, Kentucky, they're the institution I was talking about that actually did this push to, basically they repatriated documentation of their community from the larger regional archive and moved it all into this house in the community. And what they did was they just put everything up. They just made everything available. They put all the photos in frames and hung them everywhere, and they put them in photo albums and put them on the table, and they put like jerseys from the high school. They just filled this house, and people go through with Post-its and they just identify everything. They'll be like, oh, that's Mrs. So-and-so. It's crowdsourcing, but it's like analog crowdsourcing. Like, that's Mrs. So-and-so. My mom was on this committee with her, or that, you know, and just write little stories about everybody. And it's literally just one of the most amazing spaces I've ever been in. Like, as soon as I saw it, I was like, has anybody already done their dissertation on this? Like, I should do my dissertation on this place. This place is amazing.
Franklin, Kentucky. I'll have to look that up. And but it sounds like you're not sure if they have a website, huh?
They might, but I bet it's not very reflective of, I mean, there's no way it can be reflective of the experience of going into the space, which is a home that they managed to buy together, you know, and fill with all the documents and ephemera that they can that represents the community that was originally in that neighborhood. It's incredible.
I'm going to check the chat once more. Jean shared a sad commentary, the E.F. Joseph photos. E.F. Joseph was an African-American photographer who beautifully photographed life in West Oakland in the 1930s and possibly 20s. I'm forgetting the decades. His photos were almost sold for the silver in the negative, Jean shares, which that's troubling. Any more questions before we end? If not, Mariah, thank you so much. This is fascinating. You're always presenting a fascinating talk and sharing your experiences. We really appreciate it. We appreciate everybody who came out and spent the evening with us in this Zoomosphere. And we'll see you next time. We have an Oakland History Center program.
I have one small question.
Yes, Charles.
This woman, Lilly Mae King Ransom, did
Mhm.
she have like grandsons that lived in Berkeley? Because they were sports stars.
I did, like I said, I tried to trace descendants of Orphan Collections and traced one of her son's descendants in Fremont at a certain point.
Because Berkeley had Gene Ransom, who was an incredible basketball point guard, and then Jeff Ransom went to the major leagues in baseball and played for the A's.
That's
I
worth
don't
looking
think
into.
they were
Yeah.
related.
Yeah, probably not.
All right, everybody. We're going to say bye to Mariah. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Mariah, for sharing your expertise and your experiences.
That was a
All
pleasure.
right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.